And of course, there's certain parameters, time requirements, rules that everyone has to follow in order to defer 100% of those capital gains. So most people think, well, I'll just have my brother hold my money. It's not a big deal. Well, I don't know that you trust your brother.
Gonzalez with 805 Title. I'm super excited to have a special guest with me today, Megan Destito with Southern California Exchange Services, specializing in 1031 exchanges as a qualified intermediary. Okay, so Megan, thanks so much for coming into the studio today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So, I think the goal for today is to understand a little bit more about 1031 exchange, what's happening in your side of the business, specifically around real estate and 1031 exchanges, given, the current dynamics of what's happening in the market, maybe some truths and also some myths around 1031 exchanges.
Perfect.
Okay, cool. So what is a 1031 exchange? Why are they part of the real estate, transactions, and when do they come into play?
1031 exchanges have been around for over 100 years. So it's part of the tax code, Section 1031 of the Internal Revenue Code, that allows real estate investors to defer paying capital gains tax when they're selling an investment property. Okay. And of course, there's certain parameters, time requirements, rules that everyone has to follow in order to defer 100% of those capital gains.
Okay, so this is really a part of deferring capital gains when somebody owns an investment property only, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it does not apply to primary residential properties.
Right. So when we're talking about 1031 exchanges, it has to be a property or land, something real estate that's held for investment purposes. So it's not personal use. So your primary residence is under a completely different tax code, Section 121, and you get your own exclusions through that. So in order to defer the gain on an investment property, it has to be held for productive use, business, rental, something along those lines.
What type of properties would qualify for a 1031 exchange? I mean, is it only single family, or like what kind of properties?
No, you'd be surprised at how many ways. There's a lot of flexibility within the exchanges, which is what gets me excited, because we're not talking just residential. And residential is like a house, a condo, an Airbnb, a vacation home. So there's many ways that you can utilize residential properties for an exchange, but there's a lot of commercial real estate assets that qualify. And so I think what most real estate investors don't realize is how easy it is for them to get into commercial real estate. You can buy pieces of commercial properties and it qualifies for an exchange. And it allows people, I would say people who are just tired of being the manager, it allows them to buy into a piece of a property that already has professional management in place. They don't have to worry about the tenant. It's just passive income. So it's a lot of maybe people who are preparing for retirement. Like it's a great way to start to shelter your assets, diversify your real estate portfolio. And so you're talking about commercial shopping centers, Amazon distribution centers, apartment buildings, office spaces, surgical centers. There's so many. Gas stations, restaurants.
So literally any really kind of type of property that is just being held or owned as an investment property.
Yes. And in order for that to qualify, let's just say you have an investment property, but in order to get the benefit of the exchange, you have to look like you're a long-term investor. So you cannot be a person who's flipping real estate. And that's really important, because a lot of people want to get that and have that fly under the radar. And when it comes tax time, they're filling out or their accountant is filling out a specific tax form. It's Form 8824. And it's asking when they acquired that property, the date that they, sold that property. So the IRS will know that you haven't held on to it long enough to be deemed a long-term investor.
So what good segue there, right? So what is long enough? How much time does somebody need to own a property in order to qualify for a 1031 exchange?
So this is what's fun about the IRS is that there's a lot of gray area. They don't make it absolutely specific.
Okay.
So there's not a specific interpretation of the tax code of what defines a long-term investor. But based off of enough court cases, if you've held onto the property for at least 1 year, they would probably say you're okay. More conservative is 2 years plus.
Okay.
So, and I think it depends on your personal scenario. So maybe you acquired a property and then maybe like the neighborhood went bad and you need to get out, you know, that maybe there's variations of why you're doing what you're doing. And so there's reasons that you could plead your case of, maybe I'm not a long-term investor in your eyes, but I needed to get out. And that's why I did what I did.
Okay. All right. So there's some, it's not exactly black and white,
right?
But seems like it has to be within reason.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. So when, for whatever reasons, you know, people need to sell an investment property, at which point do they contact somebody like you? And then what are kind of some of those steps? Like what happens? What do you inform them? What does that consultation look like?
So I get calls throughout the whole process. I get calls when people are just thinking about it, which I prefer because I like to know what their goal is. And that way I can help maybe guide them if they don't know where they're going to invest their funds. And I think one thing that I need to make sure that I point out is that in order to do an exchange, you have to reinvest the funds from that sale into another investment property that's equal or greater in value. And you have to do that within 180 days.
Okay. So there's a time clock that, that they're running under.
Right. So if you don't have a plan ahead of time, that's extremely stressful on, especially in this market where inventory is so limited, on where am I going to get a deal? Like, I don't know that I'm ready to list my property if I don't know where I'm going to buy.
Okay.
And so I like to be involved, like I said, when they're thinking about listing the property. There's nothing I can do at that point in time, but at least I know that that's where their mind is at, you know? But once they've actually entered a contract, the seller and the buyer, once there's a contractual obligation and they're about to open up escrow, that's when I get involved. There's nothing I can do until I have a copy of the title report, a copy of the contract. So what I'm doing is I'm preparing documents for the client. So if they were ever to get audited, there's viable proof that they have entered into a proper exchange. It's legal documentation, yada, 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 right?
Okay.
And that the most important is that I'm holding their funds.
Gotcha.
So I have to be able to instruct the escrow officer that, hey, I'm actually operating on the seller or the buyer's behalf, depending on which transaction it is, if it's the sale or the purchase. And I'm kind of folding myself into the transaction. So my documentation is actually saying that at the moment of close, my company is stepping in as the seller or the buyer, and that's how I can operate on their behalf. And so by doing that, I am stepping in, but I'm instructing the escrow officer to say, hey, by me doing this, the money isn't going to go to the client. It's going to go to me, and I'm going to hold it on their behalf. And within that, it allows them to defer the gain, because once you touch those monies as an investor,
the seller.
Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. To be clear, the seller, once those funds, as I'm operating on the seller's behalf, if they were to touch those monies themselves, they would be they call it constructive receipt, and they'd be taxed.
Gotcha.
So by avoiding all of that, you have to relinquish and give up control, give up benefit to that property, and allow me to step in on your behalf.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's really important, like those steps and processes are followed to the T, because you could be disqualified.
Absolutely.
And taxed on income or proceeds that were unintentional.
Absolutely. And there needs to be specific verbiage in those contracts that the IRS is looking for if they're going to audit you, to make sure that you actually used a qualified intermediary, somebody who's not related to you. Right. So most people think, well, I'll just have my brother hold my money. It's not a big deal. Well, I don't know that you'd trust your brother, but you want to make sure that it's arm's length.
Right.
So,
okay, that makes sense. And so, when it comes to escrow and title, because that's what I do, is, you have these properties, these investment properties held either in a trust or in some sort of entities, and the percentage of ownerships and the vestings, how they get held. How do you, as the intermediary handle those types of 1031 exchanges as an accommodator, and like the percentage of ownerships and how that needs to then be qualified?
Sure. So when we're talking about the vesting, how they're holding title in the exchange, it has to be the same vesting from the sale into the purchase. So if your goal, let's just say you are in a family trust and you don't want to purchase in the trust, then you need to get out of the trust ahead of time before you're listing that property for sale, so that the title report will show that there's been an amendment to the title and this is how the property is now vested. Maybe they quit claim their interest, however that works out. And that way they're free to purchase the replacement property in the vesting that they ultimately want. So that's why I like to know ahead of time, like I like to be involved before we're listing, to know that's one of the aspects of what is your goal? Like, how do you want to hold title? So if you are owning, 50% of the property, that should show up on the title report, and how you held title. So if you're a 50% owner as husband and wife, you can go and purchase 100% of another property, but it needs to be as husband and wife. You just want to make sure that the numbers work. So in order to defer all of it, that 50% ownership, let's just say your 50% is valued at $1 million, then you need to make sure that you're purchasing another property at $1 million.
Gotcha.
If you buy down in value, you can do that, but you're just creating a taxable event. It's not jeopardizing the whole exchange by doing that.
So it sounds like there's definitely some strategic planning and research and consulting that really needs to take place almost at the very beginning, because it seems like if people aren't uncovering and understanding the vesting and the percentages and the title, and like there could be some mishaps there. Right.
So that's why it's not my responsibility to do that. It really falls to the client, to the exchanger, to the investor, that they are getting their legal advice. So it's hard for me because I give them enough information so that they're informed, but the responsibility falls to them. Like, you need to make sure that you're working with your legal team, whether that's your attorney or your accountant, to make sure that you're meeting your financial goals and that you're not jeopardizing those goals by not crunching the numbers correctly.
Okay, that makes sense. And so, like, what areas do you cover as, the 1031 exchange service, here?
So it's part of a federal statute. So I operate nationwide.
Oh.
So I just did a deal where a client purchased a property in New York. They sold out of California. They bought in New York. Okay. So it's, of course, my local California market is what I focus on, because that's where I'm probably going to get most of my transactions from. But you can cross state lines, just like I said. So as long as the property that you're selling or buying is an investment property anywhere in the United States, it will work for your exchange.
Excellent. And, I think we kind of even just skipped maybe just a little background, how you even became, how you got involved in this industry, this side of the industry, I should say. Give us a little insight on that.
I kind of fell into it. And my history goes back to out of college. So out of college, I came out to California in the 2000s, and the year 2000. And so I was trying to find a job to get me off my feet. And I got a job up in Santa Barbara working for a husband and wife. The husband was a real estate attorney and the wife handled the 1031 exchanges. And within the first week, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a career, because I majored in marine biology. I mean, my background is science. You don't get further from real estate than that, I don't think. Yeah. So this was all new to me. But what I found so fascinating was the intricacies of the transaction, how convoluted and complicated it could be, and yet the different avenues that I would be able to reach. So I would be meeting with very savvy real estate investors, novice investors, but I was meeting escrow and title. I was, financial advisors. So it's just commercial brokers. You just start meeting so many different people. And I found that this type of industry interesting enough where I was like, I actually get to use my brain. And that's what I really liked about it is I like to be challenged. No two exchanges are ever really the same. Right. And then I'm valuable. Right. So, it's so specific that it's, I'm needed. So
I always like to say the riches are in the niches.
Yes. Right? I like it. Yeah.
That's awesome. So, how can people get in touch with you?
Easy. So you can find me. I'm big on social media. So you can, what do you call it? A tag? Yes. I sound so old right now, but that's at SCES 1031 on Instagram. But my number 805-738-2599. You can email me, Megan, MEGAN at SCES1031.com.
Yeah. And she actually is really doing some cool stuff on Instagram. If you're not following her, definitely. I like to call it edutainment, right? So
yes, I'm all about humor.
It's very entertaining. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you again, Megan, for coming in. Sure. Megan with Southern California Exchange Services as 1031 exchanges as a qualified intermediary.
It's a mouthful.
But if you're an investor or if you know of anybody who is going through or potentially going through a selling of an investment property, you're going to need both of us. You're going to need accommodator, 1031 exchange, intermediary, and then you're also going to need, title and escrow, and that's what we do with 805 title and 805 escrow. So it's Sergio Gonzalez signing off. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. You know where to find us. All right, see ya.